The air in the small suburban town of Green Hollow felt heavy, burdened by the weight of unspeakable secrets and shattered trust. On a crisp autumn morning, the local police department was called to a scene that would shake the town to its core. Inside a modest home, a life had been taken, brutally, unexpectedly, and with a chilling finality. The victim, Mark Reynolds, a man who had once been the pride of the community. Mark had been married to Emily for 10 years. Their marriage on the outside had seemed like the perfect picture of love, commitment, and mutual respect. To their friends and family, they were the couple everyone admired, the ones who had weathered all storms together, raised two children, and built a life others could only dream of. But beneath the surface, the cracks had been forming for years, unnoticed by the people who thought they knew them best. The couple's relationship had once been marked by passion, deep emotional connection, and shared dreams. They had been inseparable in the early years, their lives intertwined in ways that made it impossible to imagine one without the other. But as the years passed, the intensity of their bond began to fade. Work, children, and the monotony of everyday life gradually chipped away at their connection, leaving behind a hollow version of the love they once had. They found themselves growing apart, both emotionally and physically. Emily had always been the nurturing type. She had given herself fully to Mark and their children, always putting them first. Mark, on the other hand, had started to pull away. He had become distant, focused on his career, and obsessed with maintaining the image of success. There was little time left for Emily, and even less for their marriage. As the years went by, Emily began to sense something was wrong. She could feel it in the way Mark no longer looked at her the same way, in the way he was absent even when he was physically present. Despite her attempts to reconnect with him, Emily couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that she was losing him. Then one fateful day, Mark's health took a dramatic turn. He had been struggling with a chronic kidney condition for years, and his doctors had warned him that he would eventually need a transplant. Emily, despite the growing emotional distance between them, made the decision to donate one of her kidneys to save his life. At the time, Emily thought it was an act of love. She hoped that this sacrifice would bring them closer, that it would heal the rift between them. But what she didn't know was that the donation, instead of bringing them closer, would be the catalyst for a betrayal that would destroy everything. Mark had survived the surgery and recovered, but the emotional toll it took on Emily was far greater than she could have anticipated. She had given a part of herself, literally and figuratively, to him, yet she felt more alone than ever. In the months following the surgery, Mark became even more distant, retreating into himself. He no longer expressed gratitude for her sacrifice. The intimacy they once shared became non-existent, and their communication faltered. Emily was left feeling empty, used, and bitter. She had given him life, and in return, he had given her nothing but indifference. The marriage, once full of promise, had become a ghost of what it had been. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in Mark, that the man she had once known had disappeared. What hurt most was that, despite everything, she still loved him. The turning point came one evening when Emily stumbled upon a series of text messages on Mark's phone. The messages were explicit and left little to the imagination. They were from a woman named Sarah, a colleague of Mark's from work. The messages were filled with flirtations, promises of secret meetings, and references to their physical encounters. Emily's heart sank as the reality of the situation hit her. Mark had been unfaithful. It wasn't just the infidelity that shattered Emily. It was the timing. She had given him a piece of her life, sacrificing her body for his survival, and in return, he had cheated on her. The betrayal cut deeper than she could have ever imagined. The anger that simmered inside her was overwhelming, but she hid it, choosing not to confront Mark immediately. Instead, she let the pain fester, turning into something darker, something more dangerous. The idea of revenge began to take root in her mind. She had been hurt in the worst way possible, and she felt as though there was no justice for her. The thought of Mark's betrayal, his lack of remorse, and the emptiness she felt only fueled her desire for retribution. Emily wanted him to feel the same pain she had felt. She wanted him to understand the gravity of what he had done. Emily had never been a woman who sought revenge. She had always been patient, forgiving, and kind. But this was different. But this was different. Mark's actions had left her feeling powerless, and now she would make sure that he would never forget the cost of his betrayal. As the days passed, Emily began to make her plans. The anger that had once been a quiet whisper in her mind had now become a loud, insistent voice, urging her forward. She thought of the life they had built together, the years they had spent, the children they had raised. All of it seemed irrelevant now. What mattered was that Mark had betrayed her, and he would pay the price. Emily's plan was simple. She would make Mark feel the same sense of helplessness that she had felt for so long. She would take everything from him, the trust, the love, the family, and leave him with nothing. It wasn't just about making him suffer. It was about reclaiming the control that he had taken from her. The path to revenge was set. The consequences of her actions, however, were still unclear. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she could no longer live with the pain of Mark's betrayal. Emily was ready to take matters into her own hands, no longer content to wait for justice to come. The first step was already in motion, and as she stared at the reflection in the mirror, she realized there was no turning back now. The days that followed the discovery of Mark's betrayal were like a slow, suffocating descent into a darkened abyss. Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in a life she no longer recognized. The world around her moved in a blur, the ticking of the clock an incessant reminder of the time slipping away, time she would never get back. It felt as though everything she had once known, every dream she had shared with Mark, had been obliterated in an instant. The life they had built together now seemed like a cruel joke, a facade for the reality that lay hidden behind the doors of their home. In the days following the confrontation with Mark's infidelity, Emily kept to herself. She withdrew into a shell, retreating from the world outside. She didn't speak to friends or family, only focused on the growing storm inside her mind. The small suburban home, once a place of warmth and love, now felt cold and foreign. Every corner seemed to echo with memories of a love that no longer existed. She found herself walking through the house aimlessly, her mind clouded with anger and confusion. The children were at school and Mark was busy with work, leaving her in the quiet solitude of their crumbling home. But even in her isolation, Emily knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. She had children to care for, a life to maintain. She still had responsibilities despite everything that had happened. On the surface, she was functional, an outward semblance of normalcy. But inside, her heart was consumed by an all-encompassing rage. The pain of betrayal was a constant companion, eating away at her from the inside. Her mind often wandered back to the kidney donation. How naive she had been, believing that such an act would strengthen their bond. Instead, it had opened the door to a deeper betrayal. She had given him a part of herself, a life-saving gift, and he had repaid her with dishonesty and lust. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the irony, the one act of selflessness she had performed for him, and yet he had chosen to disregard her completely. She thought about the days following the surgery when he had been weak and vulnerable, needing her in ways that made her feel indispensable. He had leaned on her, emotionally and physically, as he recovered. She had cared for him with love, never imagining that it would lead to this moment of crushing realization. It had been a lie. Everything had been a lie. But Mark's affair wasn't just an emotional betrayal. It was a calculated physical one. He had been sneaking around, meeting with Sarah, all while Emily was by his side, looking after him and supporting him through one of the most trying periods of his life. The injustice of it all consumed her thoughts, and she began to spiral deeper into her desire for retribution. It was as though the world itself had conspired against her, forcing her into a place where only revenge seemed to offer a sense of control. Her emotions were no longer those of a betrayed wife. They had transformed into something darker, something unrecognizable. There was a growing hunger for vengeance within her, a burning desire to make Mark feel the same powerlessness and despair that she had felt. She could no longer be the docile, forgiving woman she once was. Emily had been broken, and in her brokenness, she was being reborn into something colder, more calculating, and more dangerous. The turning point came late one night when Emily was alone in the house. Mark had gone out for drinks with friends, as he often did. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her fingers tapping nervously against the surface, lost in thought. It was then that the idea first struck her, an idea so bold, so final, that it sent a shiver down her spine. She would make Mark understand the full extent of her pain. She would take something from him that he could never get back. Emily wasn't stupid. She knew that in the state of mind she was in, the thoughts swirling in her head could be dangerous. She had to be careful, methodical. There could be no room for error. She had to remain calm, composed, and deliberate. The children were a priority, of course, and she would never harm them. But Mark was another matter altogether. He had betrayed her in a way that no one ever should. He had turned her love into something grotesque. Now it was her turn to reclaim the power she had lost. The first step in her plan was simple. She needed to ensure that Mark would be alone when the time came. She had to wait for the perfect moment, a moment when he was vulnerable, just as she had been when he betrayed her. She wasn't sure exactly how it would unfold, but she knew that it would. She could feel it in her bones. The inevitable confrontation, the one that would make Mark understand just how deep her pain ran. As the days dragged on, Emily grew more determined. She began to put her plan into motion, taking small but deliberate actions to prepare for the final moment. She knew she had to keep her intentions hidden from everyone, even her closest friends and family. There was no room for sympathy, no room for second-guessing. What she had planned was final, irreversible, and it was the only way she could see herself moving forward. Each day she wore the mask of the dutiful wife, doing the chores, caring for the children, maintaining the illusion of a functional family. But inside she was a different person. Emily was no longer just a wife. She was a woman on the edge, a woman who had been broken and was now determined to make those who had hurt her feel the full force of her wrath. The days turned into weeks, and Emily's resolve only grew stronger. Mark, oblivious to the storm brewing within her, continued with his life as if everything were normal. He was none the wiser to the transformation happening before his very eyes. He still carried on with his affair, still spent his nights out with friends, and still took Emily's love and loyalty for granted. But Emily knew better now. She knew that love could be twisted, that trust could be shattered, and that sometimes the only way to take control was through the destruction of everything that had once mattered. Emily had already made her decision. She had no more room for doubt, no more room for remorse. Her plan would come to fruition soon. The last chapter of their marriage had already been written. The only thing left was the final act. She was ready, and when the time came, nothing would stop her. As the weeks passed, the weight of Emily's decision began to press down on her, suffocating her with the constant reminders of the life she had once had. Every corner of the house carried memories of happier times, of when things had felt right. But now those memories only served to deepen the ache in her chest. The betrayal she had endured at Mark's hands had shattered everything, everything they had built, everything they had shared. No longer was she the loving wife who had given everything for the sake of her family. No, now she was a woman consumed with a thirst for retribution, her heart hardened by the crushing weight of her husband's infidelity. But even in her anger, Emily's mind remained clear. She knew that the only way to regain her sense of control was to sever the ties that bound her to Mark. Those ties that for so long had been the foundation of her identity. She would have to take something from him that he could never replace. She had given him life, literally, and he had thrown it all away. Now it was time for him to pay the price. Mark, as oblivious as ever, carried on with his normal routines. He came and went as he pleased, often staying late at the office or out with friends. He still hadn't picked up on the distance that had grown between him and Emily. The cracks in their marriage had been there for years, but they had always managed to patch them over with words and empty promises. Now those cracks were beyond repair. The foundation of their marriage had been corroded by lies and deceit, and there was no salvaging what had once been. Emily's thoughts turned to the night when everything would fall into place. The first step in her plan was to get Mark to trust her completely again. She needed him to believe that everything was normal, that the betrayal had been forgiven. She wanted him to drop his guard, to think that he had won her back. That was the moment she would strike. She knew she had to wait for the right opportunity. It wasn't just about timing, it was about manipulation. Emily had become a master of emotional control. Over the years, she had learned to read Mark's moods, his habits, his insecurities. She knew exactly when he would be most vulnerable, when he would be least prepared for what was coming. She had to make him feel as though he had regained his place in her life, even though she was already planning his downfall. In the meantime, life at home continued as if nothing had changed. Emily attended to her children with the same care and attention as always, keeping up the appearance of a devoted mother. But her mind was elsewhere. She spent her nights plotting, her mind racing with the possibilities of how she would make Mark pay. She couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction in knowing that she had the power to decide his fate. Every day that passed was one step closer to the moment when she would finally have the upper hand. One evening, as Emily prepared dinner for the family, she heard the familiar sound of Mark's car pulling into the driveway. She didn't flinch, didn't allow herself to react. She had been expecting this moment, and she was ready. Mark entered the house, his usual confident stride betraying no hint of what was about to unfold. He greeted her with a kiss on the cheek, an attempt at normalcy, but Emily didn't respond with her usual warmth. Instead, she simply nodded and continued chopping vegetables, her movements precise, deliberate. "Hey, everything okay?" Mark asked, his voice casual. He didn't notice the tension in the air, didn't sense the change in her demeanor. "Fine," Emily replied curtly. She didn't want to engage in conversation, didn't want to waste any more energy pretending that everything was fine. She had long since stopped pretending for his sake. "Dinner will be ready in a few minutes," she added, her voice flat. Mark sat at the kitchen table, pulling out his phone to check messages, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside his wife. Emily could feel the anger rising within her, but she pushed it down. She couldn't afford to lose control. Not yet. She had to be patient. As the days went by, Emily's plan began to take shape. Mark remained oblivious to the tension in the air, going about his life as usual. But Emily knew that the moment would come soon, the moment when everything would finally come crashing down. She had already made up her mind. There was no turning back. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Emily sat in the living room, the soft hum of the television filling the silence between her and Mark. They sat together on the couch, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. She could see the way Mark's eyes wandered, distracted by the buzzing of his phone, his mind clearly elsewhere. It was a stark contrast to the man she had once known, the man who had promised to love her, to cherish her, through sickness and health. That man was gone, replaced by someone who had no respect for the woman who had given him everything. "Mark," Emily said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. He looked up from his phone, his expression blank. "We need to talk." "About what?" Mark asked, his voice dismissive. He still didn't sense the seriousness of the conversation that was about to unfold. "About us," she replied, her eyes steady, unwavering. "About everything that's been going on." Mark sighed, clearly annoyed. "Emily, we've been through this. Can't we just move on from it?" "No," Emily said firmly. "We can't just move on. I gave you everything, Mark. Everything. And you just threw it all away." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He could sense that this conversation was different from the others they'd had, the ones where they had tried to patch things up with empty words. But it was too late for apologies now. Too late for anything. Emily had made up her mind. "We're done, Mark," she said quietly, her voice steady but full of finality. Mark looked at her in confusion, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean we're done?" "I mean," Emily said, her tone colder than it had ever been, "I'm done. I'm done with you. I'm done with this marriage." For a moment, Mark said nothing. He looked at her, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. He had never seen this side of her before. Emily had always been the forgiving, patient wife, the one who would stand by him no matter what. But now she was someone else entirely. Mark couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily's face, her expression cold, hard, like a stranger. He kept replaying the conversation they had earlier, the finality in her words ringing in his ears. "I'm done," it echoed in his mind, louder than anything he had ever heard. He knew she was upset, that the betrayal had hurt her deeply, but he never imagined it would come to this. He had always believed they could work through anything. After all, hadn't they survived so much together already? Mark tossed and turned, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. He had always been able to fix things before, to talk his way out of trouble, to manipulate the situation until it favored him. But not this time. This time, Emily was different. She wasn't the same woman he had married, the one who would always forgive and forget. No, she had changed, and that scared him. The weight of his actions began to settle on him like a heavy blanket, stifling his breath. He had never intended for things to go this far. He had always convinced himself that his infidelity was just a momentary lapse in judgment, something that didn't mean anything. But now he understood the cost. He understood how much he had hurt Emily, how much he had taken for granted. He had cheated on her. After everything she had done for him, after she had given him a part of herself, literally, he had betrayed her. And now he was facing the consequences. Emily wasn't just angry anymore. She was resolute. She had made up her mind, and nothing he could say or do would change that. But Mark wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. His mind raced with thoughts of how he could fix things, how he could convince her to stay. He had always been able to charm her, to make her believe in him again. Maybe all he needed was the right words, the right actions. He would beg for forgiveness. He would prove to her that he was still the man she had married, the man who had promised to love her, to cherish her, in sickness and in health. The next morning, Mark tried to approach Emily with the same determination he had always had. He went into the kitchen where she was preparing breakfast for the kids, the same routine they had followed for years. He watched her, waiting for the right moment to speak. But when she turned to face him, her eyes were empty, distant. "Emily," Mark began, his voice soft, "I'm sorry. I know I've hurt you, but please, can we talk about this? I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Emily didn't even flinch. She simply nodded, but her expression remained unreadable. Mark could feel the emotional wall she had built between them. It was impenetrable. "I've made so many mistakes," he continued, his voice cracking. "But I want to fix this. I don't want to lose you. You mean everything to me." But Emily didn't respond. She just went back to what she was doing, the sound of the knife chopping vegetables filling the silence. Mark stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do next. His words, once so effective, now seemed hollow. He was lost. As the day went on, the tension between them only grew. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that Emily was slipping away from him. No matter how hard he tried to get her to open up, she remained closed off, unreachable. He could see the change in her, how the light in her eyes had dimmed, how her smile no longer reached her eyes. She wasn't the woman he had fallen in love with. She had transformed into someone he didn't recognize, someone who had hardened herself against him. That evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Mark sat alone in the living room, staring at the TV, though he wasn't really watching it. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the guilt and regret that had been eating away at him since the conversation with Emily. He had tried everything, but nothing seemed to work. She was resolute in her decision to end their marriage, and he had no idea how to change that. It was then that he noticed the note on the coffee table. It was in Emily's handwriting, neat and precise. His heart skipped a beat as he reached for it, his hands trembling slightly as he unfolded the paper. "I need to do something for myself," the note began. "I've given everything to this marriage, Mark. I've given you my love, my health, my life. But you threw it all away. I need to find who I am again, apart from you. I can't keep living like this." Mark's breath caught in his throat as he read the words again. The finality of them hit him like a punch to the gut. Emily was leaving. She was done. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. The next few days were a blur for Mark. Emily continued to go about her daily routine, but there was a coldness between them that he couldn't ignore. They barely spoke, and when they did, it was only about the practicalities of the household. Who would pick up the kids from school? What time dinner would be? When they would meet with the divorce lawyer? Everything felt mechanical, robotic. The emotional connection that had once been there was gone, replaced by a hollow silence that seemed to grow louder with each passing day. Mark had no idea what to do. He had never felt so lost, so helpless. Emily had always been his anchor, the one person who kept him grounded. And now she was slipping away, and he didn't know how to get her back. He had cheated on her, yes, but he had never imagined it would cost him everything. As the days turned into weeks, Mark's desperation only deepened. He tried everything he could think of to fix things, but it was clear that Emily was beyond reach. She had made her decision, and he had lost her. It was then that the final crack appeared. Emily's behavior became more distant, more closed off. She stopped engaging with him altogether, her heart completely shut off from him, and Mark, for all his efforts, was powerless to change it. In the midst of his own turmoil, Mark began to notice something else, a strange change in Emily's demeanor. She was no longer the woman who had once stood by him no matter what. She had become colder, harder, and in the pit of his stomach, Mark felt a growing sense of unease. The calm before the storm was about to break. Emily had endured too much, and now it was her turn to make a choice. She had been patient for so long, but the time for patience had run out. Emily had always been the pillar of their family. From the moment they had met, she had been the one who held everything together. Mark's chaotic work schedule, the kids' school events, the household chores, and their social life. She had been the one who quietly sacrificed her own desires and needs for the sake of the family. But something had changed. Something deep within her had shifted, and she knew as the days stretched into weeks that she could no longer continue pretending that everything was okay. The pain of betrayal still stung, but it wasn't just the infidelity that hurt. It was everything that had led to this point. Mark had cheated on her, yes, but he had also taken so much from her over the years. He had taken her time, her energy, her health. He had taken the very thing that had once bound them together, the trust. And no matter how many times he apologized, no matter how many times he swore he was sorry, it wasn't enough. Emily had never been one to seek revenge, but the way Mark had treated her after all she had done for him had pushed her to a breaking point she hadn't known existed. She had donated one of her kidneys to save his life when he had been diagnosed with kidney failure. She had given him a part of herself, something so intimate, so precious, in the hopes that he would recognize how much she loved him. But instead of gratitude, he had turned around and betrayed her in the worst possible way. The weight of her decision to end their marriage felt heavy, but there was also a strange sense of relief that came with it. She had tried everything: therapy, discussions, long nights spent wondering if they could salvage what they had. But each time, she came back to the same conclusion. It was over. She couldn't fix what had been broken, and even if she could, it wasn't worth the cost to her soul. For weeks, Emily had been living in a fog. She had gone through the motions of daily life, feeding the kids, attending work, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. But in the silence of her own thoughts, she had been planning. She had been working her way toward a resolution that she had never thought possible. No, she wasn't going to walk away and let Mark off the hook. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. She was going to take control of her life, and she was going to make sure he understood the consequences of his actions. She had been silent for so long, but her silence had allowed the storm to grow inside her. She had allowed the hurt, the betrayal, the anger to fester until it became something far greater than she had ever anticipated. And now it was too late to turn back. Emily wasn't sure exactly when she had decided that she would take things to a darker place. She had thought about the practicalities of leaving, getting a lawyer, dividing the assets, and finding a way to navigate the inevitable fallout. But there was a voice inside her, one she could barely recognize, telling her that leaving wasn't enough. Mark needed to understand the gravity of what he had done, and she would make him understand. She would make him see what it meant to betray someone who had given everything for him. Mark was the one who had started this mess, and he would be the one who would end it. Over the next few days, Emily became even more distant. She continued to act like everything was normal on the surface, but internally she was preparing herself for what was to come. She had thought through every detail carefully. There would be no room for mistakes, no chance for Mark to turn things around at the last minute. She couldn't afford for him to apologize, to beg for another chance. She had made up her mind, and nothing would sway her now. On the evening before everything was set into motion, Emily sat alone in their bedroom, staring at the framed photograph of the family they used to be. She looked at their smiles, their happiness frozen in time, and she felt nothing but emptiness. She had loved him once, maybe even more than she had ever loved anyone. But that love had withered away, crushed under the weight of his lies and his betrayal. She had heard the stories of women who had taken revenge, who had gotten back at their husbands in unimaginable ways. But Emily wasn't like those women. She had never been impulsive or rash. She was a planner, a thinker, and everything she did would be calculated, deliberate. She wasn't out of control. She was simply taking back what was hers, her dignity, her self-respect, and her future. The next morning, Mark tried to approach her again, but she was already far beyond any conversation he wanted to have. His desperate apologies fell on deaf ears. She had heard it all before, and she was done. He had no idea what was coming. No idea that Emily's heart had hardened to a point where no apology could undo the damage he had done. No idea that she was about to take matters into her own hands. As Emily left the house that morning, she didn't look back. She didn't feel the weight of her decision, at least not yet. All she could focus on was what lay ahead. The path she had chosen was dangerous, but it was also the only path that made sense. She would no longer be the woman who forgave and forgot. She would no longer be the woman who gave everything and received nothing in return. She was taking control, and Mark was about to learn exactly what it meant to betray someone who had once loved him. The days following Emily's departure from their home were the calm before the storm. Mark, despite the seeming normalcy of his actions, was oblivious to the disaster that was about to unfold. He tried to act like nothing had changed, still showing up at work and handling the kids as if the facade of their broken marriage could be patched up. But deep down, he knew something was different. He could feel it, the unspoken tension in the air when he returned home, the coldness in Emily's eyes when they exchanged words. Yet he refused to confront it, clinging to his hope that time would heal the wounds he had inflicted. But Emily wasn't waiting for time. She had been planning. Every conversation, every action she took was a calculated move, leading to a decision that she knew, deep down, would change everything. She wasn't just going to walk away quietly. She had given Mark a second chance with her kidney, a piece of herself that could never be replaced. But when he betrayed that sacrifice, when he had thrown their family's trust away in pursuit of his own desires, she had drawn a line in the sand. The weight of her decision was heavy, but she had already made up her mind. For days, Emily quietly went about her life, her emotions buried beneath a controlled exterior. She had gotten a job at a small law office, something to keep her mind occupied. She attended meetings and returned to her old hobbies, things that had once been hers before they had become buried beneath the demands of marriage and motherhood. But all the while, her thoughts were consumed with what was to come. She knew what had to be done. The plan was simple. There was no room for hesitation, no room for second-guessing. She had already put the pieces into motion. A meeting had been set up at their house, a meeting that Mark had been looking forward to. Emily had agreed to meet with him to discuss their divorce, a final conversation to settle the financial details and custody arrangements for their children. She had already contacted her lawyer, making sure everything was in place. This was her moment. She was going to make sure that Mark understood just how much his betrayal had cost him. When the day arrived, Emily was calm. Too calm, in fact. She had rehearsed what she was going to say over and over in her mind. But she knew that the words would come naturally when the time was right. She would stay composed, letting Mark's guilt and his understanding of what he had done fill the room. She wasn't there for reconciliation or closure. She was there to make him feel the pain he had caused. The meeting took place in their living room, where they had spent years of their lives together. The couch where they had once laughed, the walls where they had celebrated their achievements, and the kitchen where they had prepared meals as a family. Everything was a reminder of what they once had. But now it all seemed empty to Emily, a hollow shell of a life that had been destroyed by one moment of selfishness. Mark greeted her with a hesitant smile, but Emily could see the nervousness in his eyes. He had no idea what she was about to do. He was still clinging to the hope that he could convince her to stay, that they could work things out. He had no idea that Emily had already made her decision, that she had been living with the consequences of his actions long before this moment. "Emily," Mark said, his voice betraying a trace of unease. "I've been thinking a lot about us lately. I know things haven't been perfect, but I really want to make this right. We can fix this." Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked at him with a steady gaze, her expression unreadable. She had heard these words so many times before, but they meant nothing now. There was no fixing this, no going back. "I don't think you understand, Mark," she said quietly, her voice low but firm. "It's not about fixing things anymore. It's about what you've taken from me, what you've taken from this family." Mark opened his mouth to speak, but Emily held up her hand, silencing him. She wasn't interested in his excuses or his apologies. She had heard enough. She had lived through years of broken promises, and now she was going to make sure he understood the consequences. "I gave you my kidney, Mark," she said softly, her voice almost trembling. "I gave you a part of me that I can never get back, and you used it as a bargaining chip for your own selfish needs. You betrayed me in the worst possible way, and now it's time for you to face the consequences." Mark's face paled. He hadn't been prepared for this. He had thought that he could win her back with words, with promises of change. But Emily wasn't asking for change anymore. She had no use for his apologies. His betrayal had pushed her to a place of no return. "I don't want to hear any more excuses," Emily continued, her voice growing stronger. "You've broken this family, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend that everything is okay. It's not, and I won't let you get away with it." Mark stood up from the couch, panic rising in his chest. He tried to step toward her, but Emily raised a hand, signaling him to stop. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had no idea how to make this right, no idea how to undo the damage he had caused. "I don't know what you want me to say," Mark said, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'm sorry, Emily. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." But Emily didn't want his apologies. She had already made up her mind. She had already chosen the path she would walk. As Mark continued to plead with her, Emily's calmness began to shift. The weight of her decision had settled deep within her, and she knew there was no turning back now. She had been planning for this moment, and she was prepared. She would no longer be the victim in this story. No longer would she let him walk away unscathed. Mark's words trailed off as Emily slowly stood up, her movements deliberate and controlled. He had no idea that this was the moment his life was about to change forever. He had no idea that Emily was about to show him the consequences of betrayal. With one final look, Emily walked toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Mark called her name one last time, but she didn't turn around. She knew exactly what she was going to do. The night air was thick with tension as Emily stepped out of the house, the weight of her decision pressing heavily on her shoulders. Mark's last desperate pleas echoed in her mind, but she had already left that part of her behind. She had walked away from everything, the love they had once shared, the family they had built, and the trust that had been shattered by his betrayal. As she walked down the driveway, she could feel the cool breeze against her skin, as if the world itself was reminding her of the finality of what she had just done. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, her mind racing with the events of the day. She had made up her mind, but the consequences were still difficult to fully comprehend. She had been living in a fog of hurt and rage for so long, her emotions suppressed by the demands of their broken marriage, but now at this moment, it felt as though everything had come crashing down in one overwhelming wave. Emily didn't know how to explain it. The betrayal Mark had committed wasn't just about an affair. It wasn't just about him choosing someone else over her. It was about the deep sense of violation she had felt when he had taken something from her that was irreplaceable. Giving him her kidney had been an act of pure selflessness, an act of love, and he had betrayed that sacrifice by choosing to cheat, to destroy everything they had built together. She walked past their front porch, her footsteps echoing in the quiet of the night. The sound of crickets filled the air, a stark contrast to the chaotic storm brewing inside her mind. Emily's eyes were focused, determined. There was no going back now. The house that had once been a symbol of their love and their future now seemed like a foreign place to her. It was no longer home. Mark had tried to offer her an out, to apologize, to make promises he couldn't keep. But there was no room for promises anymore. He had taken too much, hurt her too deeply. Emily was no longer the woman who would settle for empty words. She had been pushed too far. As she drove, the city lights blurring past her, Emily's mind flashed back to the decision she had made earlier. She had called the lawyer, finalized the details of the divorce, and then proceeded with the plan. Mark had no idea what was coming, but she had already set things in motion. She had contacted an old friend, someone she trusted, someone who could help her complete this final act. She knew it was going to be risky, but it was the only way she could ensure that Mark would never forget what he had done. When she arrived at the small, unassuming house on the outskirts of the city, she didn't hesitate. She parked the car, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for the small bag at her side. Inside, hidden beneath a layer of clothes, was the item that would change everything. She had gone to great lengths to acquire it, ensuring there would be no trace back to her. She had always been careful, meticulous in her planning. Now it was time to put everything into motion. Her heart raced as she approached the door. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. There was no turning back. She had already made the decision to confront Mark, to make him understand the weight of his betrayal. And now in this quiet room, she would take the final step to ensure he never forgot it. Inside, the man waiting for her had been instructed to do exactly as she said. No questions asked. The arrangement was simple. He would help her execute the plan, and in exchange, he would receive the payment they had agreed upon. She handed him the small bag, her fingers trembling slightly. He nodded, understanding the gravity of what was about to happen. "You know what to do," Emily said, her voice cold and emotionless. She wasn't the same woman she had been when she walked into their home that morning. The decision had been made. The anger and hurt had been channeled into one final act of revenge. Mark had crossed a line, and she would make sure he paid for it. The man gave a curt nod and disappeared into the shadows. Emily remained where she was, standing still, her gaze fixed on the darkness in front of her. She felt numb, detached from everything around her. It was the calm before the storm. Meanwhile, back at the house, Mark was pacing, unaware of the danger that was closing in on him. He had hoped that somehow they could salvage their marriage, that somehow he could convince Emily to forgive him. But he had no idea that Emily had already moved past that point. She was no longer the woman he had married. She was someone new, someone determined to make him feel the consequences of his actions. The minutes ticked by slowly, the silence in the house oppressive. Mark's thoughts were clouded with confusion and regret. He wondered if it was too late to fix things, if there was any way to make amends for what he had done.